Professor Asampon to start. The floor is yours, Emmanuel. Thank you.
All right. Great. Thank you very much, Manas, for the introduction, to take this opportunity to, as it were, welcome everybody. So I want to stand on existing protocols, especially in terms of the time. Yeah, because it's afternoon here in Ghana, and I'm sure it may be different wherever you are. So just to welcome all of you. So for this lecture, I see it as an opportunity for all of us to, as it were, learn from each other, share experiences, and then, of course, pick one or two as we go on with the discussion later on. So we'll be talking on measurement of implementation research outcomes. And the hope is that by the time we are done, we should be able to define implementation research outcomes. We should be able to identify tables that describe the implementation context, and then also to describe the measurement research outcomes. So what do we mean when we say implementation research outcomes? Generally, we want to define implementation outcomes as the effects of very deliberate and purposive actions that are taken to implement new treatments, practices, and services. And like you will all agree with me, an intervention or treatment will not be effective if it is not implemented well. And so what happens oftentimes is that there tends to be some kind of confusion between implementation effectiveness and treatment effectiveness. One is not sure exactly what we mean when we say that. It is therefore important that we are able to distinguish between what implementation effectiveness is and what treatment effectiveness is. Now, doing so in terms of the distinction, it's very critical, because if we want to, as it were, transition intervention from, say, the laboratory setting to, say, a community health setting or health venues. Now, when all these have been done and we see failures, then it is important to know that the failure would have occurred because perhaps the intervention was not effective in that new setting, or even though it was good, but perhaps it was not deployed, correctly. And that is very, very important that we get to know that. Now, when we talk about implementation effectiveness, there is always the temptation to look at it only in terms of its fidelity. But emphasize here that implementation effectiveness actually goes beyond just measuring the fidelity. Now, it includes assessing both the adoption and uptake of the model, and of course, identifying the very factors that will either facilitate this intervention from being successful, or factors that will serve as inhibitions, or for want of a better word, the very barriers that will not allow for the uptake of the intervention. And so we are looking at factors such as acceptability, a key factor such as adoption. We're also looking at appropriateness, the costs involved, how feasible it is, of course, fidelity, penetration, and sustainability. And all these factors that I have mentioned can be used to understand how well a given implementation process is working. And so generally, these factors that I've mentioned are used to assess how well an implementation has occurred. And of course, the effectiveness of an intervention or the treatment usually would depend largely on how well it is implemented. So what are some of the definitions when you talk about those factors that I mentioned earlier? Now, when it's acceptability, you are basically looking at the perception that is held among the implementation stakeholders that giving treatment or service or practice or the innovation itself is agreeable, it's palatable or satisfactory among the stakeholders that we are talking about. When it's about adoption, you're looking at the intention, initial decision or action to try or employ an innovation or evidence-based practice. When that happens, then you're looking at the fact that when it has to do with adoption, that can actually take place. In terms of appropriateness, you're looking at the perceived fit, its relevance or compatibility of the innovation or evidence-based practice for a given practice, practice setting. You're also looking at the provider or consumer, or of course, the perceived fit of the innovation to address a particular issue or problem. I mean, cost is always important, and that is also a very key factor that we need to consider in terms of the outcomes. And here you are looking at the cost impact of an implementation effort. In terms of feasibility, you're looking at the extent to which a new treatment or innovation can be successfully used or carried out within a given agency or setting. For fidelity, you're looking at the degree to which an intervention was implemented as it was prescribed in the original protocol or as it was intended by the program developers. In terms of penetration, it is the integration of a practice within a service setting and its subsystems. So the service setting may already be there, but because there's been a new innovation, you're actually trying to see how that can be fused into the already existing system that is there. And then, of course, lastly, but not the least, sustainability. You are looking at the extent to which a newly implemented treatment is meant or institutionalized within a service settings on stable operation. Of course, when you look at these factors, Procter and colleagues have done extensive work, and usually the recommendation is that if you are able to get hold on any of the papers that they have published, it gives a a better understanding of what these factors are. So one may ask, what will be the usefulness of implementation outcomes? Clearly, implementation outcomes serve as necessary preconditions for attaining subsequent results in clinical or service outcomes. It's also useful for measuring the success or failure of an implementation process. And here we are directed to take a look at the maternity home access in Zambia study paper. And what exactly happened with this paper? As we can see here. Now, we all know that maternity weight represents just try to improve access to safe delivery, especially for women living in remote areas. And I'm sure for many of you, you possibly may have such a facility in your setting. Of course, we in Ghana do have one in a place called Osuwe. And we've had, a number of, opportunities, students, and then implementation research courses to go see exactly how it functions. Now, we all know that it is not only the effectiveness of the intervention, but also the effectiveness of their implementation when that is done, it enables you to appropriately interpret what outcomes. Now, the maternity homes access in Zambia project sought to evaluate the impact of a maternity waiting home model on women's access to safe delivery in rural Zambia. And if you read the paper, it tries to investigate the effectiveness of the implementation of, that MHH, I mean, the model, the maternity waiting home model. And what they sought to do was not only to document its fidelity, but also identify factors that influence the implementation success and, of course, the effect on longer-term sustainability. And I will encourage all of you here to look out for this paper, because it is, I mean, when you read, you tend to understand really that it's always good to go beyond just measuring fidelity. In fact, to also even consider, mentioned earlier on, what we call the facilitators and the barriers. So what are the types of outcomes in implementation research? Now, for our purpose, our interest, like I said earlier on, are the implementation outcomes, which are the very factors that I mentioned earlier on, from acceptability through to feasibility to sustainability. Of course, we do have the service outcomes and then client outcomes as well. But what it is important to emphasize is the fact that implementation outcomes always will precede both the service outcomes and client outcomes. Of course, with service outcomes and client outcomes being impacted by the implementation outcomes, what it essentially means is that depending on how things go for the implementation outcomes, it has impact on the service outcomes as well as the client outcomes. And that's how come it's always important to ensure that the implementation outcomes are right, because subsequently you can have them also affecting positively service outcomes and client outcomes. So what are the variables that describe an implementation research context? First of all, the influence of context provides explanation to how or why certain implementation outcomes are reached. And I'm sure by now, we all have come to realize that in implementation research, context is always key, because you could take one intervention that may be rolled out in different contexts, and you expect to get different outcomes. And it will be essentially because of the context that it is rolled out in. Context is therefore considered responsible for steady to steady variations in outcomes. And like you all know, when we talk about context, it can be looked at from the inner and, of course, the outer situations. And here, reference is made to Dan Schroeder and colleagues and their paper on the CFIR, which is the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. And I'll show you in a minute. So this is it. As you can see here, you are talking about an innovation. And what at all is the innovation? When we talk about what the innovation is, we're actually looking at that thing that is being implemented. What exactly is it? And oftentimes we are interested in, where it's coming from in terms of the source. And here you are looking at, the group or entity that actually developed it. In terms of whether it is evidence-based or not, you're actually interested in whether that innovation has robust evidence supporting its effectiveness or otherwise. In terms of its relative advantage, you are looking at whether the innovation is better than other available innovations or current practice. You go through all that up to the cost of the innovation. And here you're looking at, the innovation purchase and if it is actually being implemented, whether it is affordable, as far as the end users are concerned, or even how it is operated. The cost that is involved when it is being operated. So we have the innovation here. And as you can see, there are a number of factors that actually will impact on the innovation. So we have here the outer setting. And the interesting thing is that there is also the inner setting, which forms part of the outer setting. And so in terms of the outer setting, there are a number of factors that are also considered. So here we have critical incidents, we have values and beliefs, we have systemic conditions, the policies and laws that are available, partnerships and connections. We also have issues to do with financing, and of course, the external pressure. And as you can see, within the inner setting also come with, all kinds of dynamics. Now, the interesting thing is that the inner setting is always part of the outer setting. And so what you realize is that the very things that are happening within the outer settings will have some kind of impact on the innovation. And then, of course, the very things that are happening within the inner setting also will impact on the innovation that we are talking about.
Emma, can I
Yes.
interrupt you, please?
Sure.
Thank you so much. I just want to highlight to the faculties and the students that this consolidated framework for implementation research, this framework is critically important. And particularly for faculties, I recently visited some of the universities and some students were not aware of this because the factors, as Emma mentioned, there are related to inner settings and outer settings. And we have to ensure when the students are designing their studies for their thesis, they do keep into consideration these factors. So please, this framework, it's very important. We need to know it by heart. I can see some of the faculty here. Please make sure that you incorporate it in your lectures. Over to you, Emma.
All right, so good. The interesting thing is that the framework has recently been updated. And I mean, I will encourage all of you to look out for it because it actually gives you, guidelines as to what exactly to do when you want to look at a particular issue or, something else. So it's very, very important that, I mean, we are all very conversant with this. And I mean, the good thing is that you can actually apply it to, different settings other than if you were doing implementation research. But then for purposes of implementation research, the consolidated framework is very, very key. So what are the factors to consider when choosing an implementation research outcomes? Of course, the choice of an outcome may be influenced by, one, you're looking at the specific barriers to the implementation that you may have observed. You're also looking at the novelty of the evidence-based practice you are trying to implement. You're also considering the setting in which the implementation is taking place. That's very, very key, because within the setting comes the contextual issues. And I mean, as you all may know by now, issues of context are very, very key. And so, for example, there may be an innovation, a proven one, I mean, evidence-based, that could be rolled out seamlessly in, say, country A. But it does not necessarily mean that you can roll it out same way in country B, just because of the contextual issues or just because of, how that particular setting is like. And that's how come it's always important that we take into account the setting in which the implementation is taking place. You're also looking at key factors such as the resources for and quality of usual training for implementation. Now, again, for the choice of an implementation outcome, Proctor and colleagues have provided some suggestions that the current stage of implementation and the unit of analysis can largely inform the choice of implementation outcomes. And a few examples have been given. So for example, if you're looking at acceptability, that may be more appropriate to study during early, stage of implementation. Because, I mean, we've talked about acceptability to be the perception that is held among implementation stakeholders, that a given treatment, service or practice or innovation is agreeable. And so within the early stages of implementation, you actually have the opportunity to actually see if it is something that is acceptable among the stakeholders. And that's how come it's been suggested that if you are looking at an outcome, especially when it is early stage of implementation, then of course, acceptability comes in handy. Again, if you are looking at sustainability, it may be more appropriately measured later in the implementation process. Let's note, when we talk about sustainability, we are looking at the extent to which the newly implemented treatment is maintained or institutionalized within a service setting that's ongoing or within, a stable operation. So, for instance, you want to know that, yes, this thing has been proven to work. Has it been integrated as part of the ongoing system? And that is how come you would want to know whether it is sustainable. And that usually will come in at the later part of the implementation process. So in the next slide, there are the implementation outcomes, as we have mentioned. Of course, there are some corresponding terminologies and examples of papers with corresponding measures. And I think that when you all have the opportunity in accessing the slides, of course, you can take a look at, a particular outcome and then what paper to look out for, how they went about it, and then the measure that was actually used. So as you can see, when it is acceptability, of course, it either can, in some of the literature, you would see the terminology satisfaction, and there is a paper to direct you as to how that can be done. In terms of adoption, you may not see adoption, but see terminologies such as uptake, utilization, initial implementation, or intention to try. When it's about appropriateness, you will see terminologies such as perceived fit, relevance, compatibility, suitability, usefulness, and practicability. And then again, if it's feasibility, you will see terminologies such as actual fits or utility. If it's fidelity, you are looking at terminologies such as whether that innovation was delivered as intended. And then in terms of penetration, you are looking at how deep that innovation has been embedded into the system. That is to say, the level of institutionalization. And then in terms of sustainability, whether it can be maintained, its continuation, and stuff like that. And like I said, you either are seeing these terms or, of course, the very popular terminologies that we normally will see in some of the papers. What I need to emphasize here, and it is important that you note, that yes, we've talked about, these implementation outcomes. They usually happen to be the most popular. And in a lot of the literature, you see these ones. But it is important you note that there may also be other implementation research outcomes, of course, depending on the context and type of intervention. But like I said earlier, these happens to be the mostly popular kind of outcomes that are measured. So, what are the key messages, for this particular presentation? First of all, it is important for us to note that implementation research outcomes are very deliberate. That's how come you see the intentional actions which are undertaken so an intervention can be delivered. Now, it is also important to note that the choice of an outcome or several of them outcomes depend on the intervention implementation stage or the phase at which one would have gotten to with the implementation. And of course, the commonly used implementation research outcomes, as I said, even though there may be other ones depending on the context, are, as we mentioned, acceptability, adoption, appropriateness, cost, feasibility, fidelity, penetration, and sustainability. And so with this, I think that the stage is now set for us to engage in some discussions, of course, comments, questions, and we all can learn from that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Emma, for such a wonderful lecture. And I must say that to me, this measurement of IR outcomes is the most important lectures in this lecture series for the students who are planning the research projects. So let's see if there are any questions, comments, any hands up? I can't see.
Manas, in the chat, there are some questions.
Okay. Let me start from top. Okay. There's a quick comment about, can we please have some past research studies done and published which can guide us when writing our research thesis, especially the application of the framework and different theories and models. I think there is, if you see at the end of these lectures, we put references, and these references, most of them are the examples from TDR projects. Maybe, Emma, can you put it back and show the homework that the students are supposed to do? You can check those references and use them actually.
Yeah, so, like I said, there are some examples here. I'm not sure if it's visible.
We can't see you. You haven't uploaded the
really?
presentation.
Let's see. Let me see. 1 minute. Oh man. Okay. What could this be? All right. Yeah. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are several of articles that have been written. And if you take a look at the Dan Schroeder's paper, of course, there are several papers that they also made reference to that can actually provide some guidance in terms of how to go about it. Okay. Is that helpful?
I hope. I can't see anyone, so hopefully. Thank you so much. And also, I think there are some, after this slide, can you go next slide? We have homework that people can, key message after that.
Yes.
After this, there must be.
Yes, there is the
chapter
actually. So there is the reference to the maternity home access, and that's how come I emphasized that that's very, very key, because it talks about, like how to go about it. I mean, in a very systematic way, what to measure and, all that. So if we can all try, our hands at identifying an implementation issue, of course, if you are able to pick out on these ones from the paper, then you can actually look at it within your setting, whatever is going on there that you see to be an implementation issue. And then you want to choose, and that is what I think for the students, it may be helpful, especially when you are coming up with, topics to investigate. I mean, topics that are IR related. That should be very, very helpful.
Yes, thank you so much. The next question is about the outcome adoption. The question is whether adoption can be measured when the intervention is already underway, but it is not effectively delivered. In other words, the question is that adoption can only be done when you are doing you're rolling out the intervention, or can it be done afterwards as well?
Right. So usually what is helpful is just to try and understand what a particular factor means. When we say adoption, we are looking at the intention, initial decision, or action to try or employ an innovation or evidence-based practice. So this is something that comes in right from the beginning, the initial stages. I think that's like I said, if you understand what a particular factor means, then you can actually apply it well and then look at it at a point when it actually fits. Otherwise, you may be measuring something that may not be applicable. And that's how come it's important you get to understand what the outcomes mean.
Yes. So any other questions? I don't see any more. Any hands up? No, I don't see. I have a question.
Sure.
The question is the difference between fidelity and, can we go back to those IR outcomes slide, please?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Can you please explain the difference between fidelity and feasibility?
All right. So when we talk about fidelity, we are looking at the extent to which the intervention was implemented as it was prescribed in the original protocol. So, for example, we would have done, let's say, something here, I mean, in Ghana, and then come up with that's you need to follow A, B, C, D. All right. Now, that happens to be the original protocol, that you need to go from A, B, C before you get to D. Now you take it to some other setting. Now, because we are the ones who developed it, the question will be whether you also rolled it out following A, B, C, D. I mean, exactly as those who developed it, meant it to be. So that's what goes into fidelity. Now, on the other hand, feasibility is the extent to which a new treatment or an innovation can be successfully used or carried out within a given agency or setting. So in terms of fidelity, you're actually looking at the very steps that were originally designed. But then when it's about feasibility, that is where, again, issues of context will come in. Because, yes, this thing must have been done in a particular setting, mindful of, those contextual issues. And mind you, those contextual issues actually informed the steps, say A, B, C, D. All right. But then if you were taking it to some other setting, you may not necessarily be able to, as it were, roll it out in terms of A, B, C, D. And so in that setting too, there may be issues of fidelity that may be very different from what would have happened in the original setting. And I think that's exactly how we need to look at it.
So can we say if an intervention is less feasible to implement, it is probably also less, it has a lower fidelity because you have to adopt it in a way, because it's not feasible to do the way that it was planned. So you had to make adaptation.
Perfect.
So it's less fiddle.
Exactly. So you see, that's how come when you say adoption, you're actually not doing it the same way that it was originally done. Yeah. But you're actually taking into account certain peculiarities within the setting in which you are rolling it out. And of course, it comes back to the issues of context that I mentioned. And that is always very, very important. Because, say, in a particular setting, yes, the innovation is good, but the people may want to access it on, say, on a Saturday. But in some parts, in a different country, yes, the thing is good, all right, but the people may not want it on a Saturday. And so they say that they would want it on a Sunday. I mean, if that happens to be the case, then, of course, the adoption comes in. So you always want to be mindful of a particular outcome, and then you know exactly what to do. Otherwise, it may be a bit confusing.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's very important indeed. So another point I just wanted to mention to everybody who's here, that when designing your research questions, I came across with several protocols for the thesis that people only talk about factors related to these factors, but we need to, now you have the whole lot, you know, you have all the material, you should rise above the only, you know, focusing on factor related to low implementation of intervention, but actually looking at what do you propose, what type of are your outcomes you're going to look at it in order to ensure that the intervention that you are studying is acceptable, or, you know, whether it has to be adopted or feasible, or, you know, all these are your outcome. I encourage you that you also, you know, review it for your projects, because just looking at what is the bottleneck, it's not really implementation research. You're just finding the problem. Quite often, these bottlenecks in some settings, they are similar. So you can do literature search and find some of them. But with a given context, you have to find, okay, this is the problem, but what would be the solution? So we really want to encourage you to expand your projects to look at the outcome or your outcome as well. Do you agree with me, Emma, or am I making things confusing?
I mean, I think that is very useful because, I mean, given a particular intervention, there may be several aspects to it. And so, I mean, you could even have, let's say, 2 or 3 students who can look at a particular issue from different dimensions. And I think that is, I mean, fairly possible. I mean, in our case, for instance, we have had students who have looked at issues, say, in malaria, but they have looked at it from very different, I mean, angles. And at the end of the day, you tend to have a better picture of, you know, what the broad issues are. You know, so I will encourage, you know, people to, I mean, look broadly at the issues instead of looking at, you know, what, I mean, just go beyond issues of factors.
Sure.
How
Thank you.
Uptake, you know, those things are all very important.
Thank you so much. We have one more questions about from a colleague from Colombia, I suppose, which says, although the implementation outcomes are defined in the Proctor's framework, they do not have a methodology to make the measurement. When an outcome has been chosen for evaluation, can several conceptual frameworks be used in a single project?
Yes, I mean, that to an extent may be possible, but I always would ask, why would you want to, you know, use several frameworks if a particular one that you've chosen is not helping? And that's how come we usually would suggest the CFIR, I mean, the consolidated framework, because, I mean, over time and then from experience, I have come to realize that, I mean, it virtually addresses, I mean, almost all the issues, you know. Maybe if we all can be very conversant with it and master it well, then subsequently we can, as it were, look at, you know, some other, I mean, theoretical models and then see if they apply. Now, because you would have understood the CFIR very well, if a particular model is really not addressing what you're looking at, you are able to pick that up so easily.
Exactly. Thank you so much. So yes, you can use different frameworks. It depends on the complexity of your projects and also your understanding of different framework. That's why that we, you know, we encourage people to start with the consolidated framework and then to move forward. So yeah. Okay. I'm not sure if there are any more questions, but I would suggest
there are more
everybody.
questions in the chat. There are several more.
Where?
Okay.
Okay. What
Okay.
degree of adaptability is allowed in a new setting to still assume fidelity is adhered to?
También podría hablarles de todos los países.
Manas, please, can you come again? Let me also make reference
Yes.
to this.
Actually, for this particular question from Morocco, we have a lecture on that is coming, okay? What degree of adaptability is allowed in a setting to still assume fidelity is adhered to?
Okay, okay. All right. I think, yes, one of the
Lectures is
chapter,
about
yes, will
this.
address that, yeah.
I think as long as the adaptability does not change entirely your outcome that you're looking for, it is allowed. But if adaptability is a lot, that it actually lose the purpose of the intervention being a scale up, of course you can't use that. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But we have a whole lecture on that is coming.
Yeah.
I mean, 2-3 slides is coming in the subsequent lectures. The next question is the outcome adoption can, yeah, we answered the other question already. Okay. Do we have anybody from Mali here? Is Hussein, are you here? I saw your name earlier. You disappeared probably. No, we don't. Okay.
Manas, I can read. I see another question in the chat. Do you want me to read it? There's one about what are the advantages and challenges. The last one.
Okay.
I don't see that.
Oh,
Please
okay.
read it. Please read it.
Yeah, so I think I can see that. What are the advantages and challenges of using a theoretical framework like CFIR to guide implementation outcome measurement? How does it compare to more inductive, empirically driven approaches? I mean, first of all, I mean, we all know that theories actually provide some kind of guidance in terms of what we seek to do. Now, for purposes of implementation research, I mean, as has been said over and over again, the CFIR has been proven to be very robust and useful, I mean, when it has to do with IR. That is not to say that there aren't other, I mean, like you've written the empirically driven approaches, but of course, one is always very comfortable using a particular framework that he or she is conversant with. And that's how come, I mean, maybe forgive my biases, but I will always make reference to the CFIR because it comes in handy, very explainable, and I mean, it provides that needed guidance that you know, one always will need. It's a bias, and so please forgive me, but that is not to say that you cannot resort to other approaches.
Exactly. So these frameworks are as guides to our implementation strategies. So yeah, they all have pros and cons, and we do have another lecture coming looking closely on their pros and cons. That's right. Okay, any other question? If not, may I invite you all kindly fill out the evaluation form that will be sent out to you after this lecture. And the purpose of this evaluation is to help us to improve on the content of the lecture and also to make sure that we have a quality improvement process as we are going to review these contents in future, okay? I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture today.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Let me thank Professor Emmanuel Asampong, who joined us. And also I would like to thank you all particularly for colleagues from Colombia, that you woke up early to
Yeah.
join us. And I do hope that I see you all next week for the next lecture. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day or evening.
Right. Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Emma.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.